Okay, so now we want to add validation support to our data entry here. And you're probably going to need this in a number of places in your application, sometimes on views, sometimes on view models, and sometimes on these helper objects that are wrappers around model objects. So it's a good candidate for putting in a common base class that you can inherit from in those different scenarios. We want that base class to support iNotifiedDataErrorInfo, and we want it to integrate nicely so that that validation gets triggered when properties change. Since we already have a base class for property change handling, it's a natural step to derive from that. So we're going to add a new class called Validatable Bindable Base. And the first thing we're going to do is inherit from Bindable Base and implement the iNotifiedDataErrorInfo interface. Now I have that interface as API stubbed out here. You can see that we have a getErrors method that gets queried with a property name, and it's expected to return a collection of errors for that property. We need to raise the errors changed event whenever new errors are added for a property, so that the binding can requery and call this again. And then we have to have a Boolean flag that tells whether there's any errors on the class. That has to stay in sync with the state of the errors for all the properties on the object. Now we can support this interface pretty simply by having a dictionary as our underlying data store that has a key of string, which is the property name, and a list of string per property, which are the errors associated with that property. Now we just need to integrate the use of that dictionary with the members down below. That implementation looks like this. All we do is go look into that dictionary when we're queried for a property. If there's any errors in there, return them as a list of strings. If there's not, return null. And drive the hasError flag by whether there's anything in the dictionary or not. Now we need to add a trigger to say when does this thing evaluate errors. Since we're inheriting from Bindable Base, we can override the setProperty method. We'll still want to call the base so that the iNotifyProperty change handling occurs. But then we can call a method that we're about to implement to trigger the validation because a property has been set. Now we could wire into this validate property any number of approaches to validation, but the most prominent approach in .NET applications these days is to use data annotations. So I'm going to add an implementation here that leverages data annotations. Data annotations contain the concept of a validation context that you can point at a given object, say what member or property on that object is being validated, and then call a method to evaluate that object. When this method is called, it will go to that property on that object and see if there's any data annotation attributes for validation. If so, it will execute them and get their results and return them in this results collection. Then we can just integrate that with our dictionary by saying if there are any results, we go and set those results as the errors for that property name. If there are not any errors, then we can remove that property from our dictionary because there's no longer any errors associated with that property. And then we raise the errors changed event so that the binding can go and requery for errors. With that in place, we can go back up to our Add Edit Customer view and go look at the bindings that were generated from our drag and drop operations. You can see they had some flags on them already to do with validation and the mode. I'm going to replace those with the minimum that we need to support Notify Data Error Info. So now on each one of the bindings, I've just put validates on notified data errors to true. That causes that binding to look when it first hooks up to its data-bound object, see if it implements iNotify Data Error Info, and if so, start querying it whenever it gets property change notifications for that property. If there are errors returned, then it will set certain attached properties on the associated control. Attached properties such as validation has errors, validation errors collection, and it's possible for it to raise events such as a validation.error event. So now we need to have something to actually validate. So we're going to go to our simple editable customer and add some data annotation attributes. We'll make the first name and last name required, and we'll use the built-in email and phone attributes to validate those. Now we just need to make the base class for this validatable bindable base instead of bindable base. And with that, we can run, go to a customer, try to edit it, clear out the first name and tab off the field, and we can see it gets red boxed. Now, unfortunately, WPF doesn't have much beyond the red boxing of the control in terms of validation indications. So let's add two enhancements here. One is that the Save button should disable when there's a validation error, and the second is that we want a tooltip on the control that shows the validation error. To support disabling the Save command, we're going to drop into the Add Edit Customer View model and modify this Set Customer method. Now when the customer is set, we're going to subscribe to the Errors Changed event and trigger the Raise Can Execute Changed. And we'll also put a check here if there's an existing customer we want to unsubscribe so that we don't leak memory. Then we just need to change our Can Save handling to check the Has Error flag of the customer object. With that in place, we can run, make our way over to editing a customer again, and now watch as this field goes invalid. As I tab off of it, the Save button disables. As soon as we have valid input, it goes enabled again. So we've got that requirement checked off. Now let's take care of the tooltip. Adding a tooltip with the validation error for the control is as simple as defining a style for it. In that style, we'll implicitly target the text box within this scope. We will set up a style trigger that watches the attached property validation has error. When that is set to true, then we'll set the tooltip property of the text box. And the value binding is a little complex here, but you can see that it's basically going to the validation.errors attached property, which is a collection for this control, goes to the current item, which will be the first item in the collection, and gets the error content, which will be the string. And it uses that to set the tooltip. So now that we have that style in place, we can run, go edit a customer, cause something else to become invalid, tab off the field. We can see that the button still disables, but then we can hover over the field and get an error indication of what's going on there. I won't demonstrate it here, but you can check out my WPF Data Binding in Depth course to show you how you can actually take over and, instead of doing a red box, add something like an icon off to the side of the control. So now we just got to get the Save handling actually wired up. And for that, we're first going to talk about dependency injection a little bit.